This story will shake you to your core. I need you to do something right now. Comment below and tell me your country and the exact time where you're watching this. Are you having morning coffee in Brazil? Is it late night in Australia? Lunch break in Germany? I want to connect with every single person watching this incredible true story. Don't scroll past without commenting. I read every single one and your support means everything. This grandmother's story of survival will change how you see strength forever. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that will make you believe in the power of fighting back. Now let me tell you about Eleanor Rose Carter and the night that almost destroyed her, but instead made her unstoppable. Eleanor Rose Carter pressed her back against the cold wooden door, her wedding dress torn at the sleeve. Her hands shook as she gripped the silver letter opener she'd grabbed from the desk. The candlelight flickered across her face, showing tears mixed with determination. Through the door, she could hear footsteps getting closer. Heavy boots on hardwood floors. The sound that would haunt her dreams for decades to come. She was 24 years old, married for exactly 3 hours, and about to make a choice that would change everything. The lace on her dress caught on the door handle as she turned it slowly. Freedom was just on the other side, but the cost of that freedom would be higher than she ever imagined. Mr. Clarence Hartsfield stood in the hallway, his gray suit perfectly pressed even at midnight. His cold blue eyes looked at Eleanor like she was nothing more than property. Behind him, the family portraits stared down from the walls. Generations of Hartsfield men who had built their wealth on the backs of others. The smell of whiskey hung in the air around him. His thick fingers drummed against his leg as he waited. This was family tradition, he had told her. Every new bride in the Hartsfield family had to honor the patriarch first. Eleanor's stomach turned as she remembered his words. Her new husband Daniel had said nothing. Just looked at his shoes and walked away. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife could. The letter opener felt heavy in her palm. Eleanor had never held a weapon before, but tonight she would do whatever it took to protect herself. The moonlight streaming through the window caught the silver blade, making it gleam. She thought about her mother back in Willow Creek, sewing quilts by lamplight. Her father at his blacksmith forge, teaching her that a person's worth comes from their character, not their bloodline. They had raised her to be strong, to stand up for what was right. Even if it meant standing alone. Even if it meant facing down a man who thought he owned her because his son had put a ring on her finger. The floorboards creaked under her bare feet as she stepped away from the door. Clarence's voice boomed through the wood. Eleanor, open this door. You're part of this family now. You'll learn our ways. His fist pounded against the door 3 times. Each bang made her jump, but she didn't move toward the handle. Instead, she backed toward the window. The Hartsfield estate stretched out below, miles of land that Clarence controlled with an iron fist. Workers' cabins dotted the landscape like tiny toys. Somewhere out there was freedom. But first, she had to get past the man who thought he could take whatever he wanted. Eleanor raised the letter opener higher. Her voice came out steady and clear, stronger than she felt inside. You'll have to break down this door, Mr. Hartsfield. And when you do, one of us isn't walking out of this room alive. The pounding stopped. Silence filled the air like a heavy blanket. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Through the thin walls, she heard whispered voices. Other family members gathering in the hallway. They were all part of this sick tradition. They all knew what was supposed to happen tonight. But Eleanor Rose Carter, the blacksmith's daughter from Willow Creek, wasn't going to be another victim. She pressed her ear to the door and heard Clarence's voice, quieter now but full of rage. This isn't over, girl. Morning will come, and you'll still be a Hartsfield. Eleanor closed her eyes and whispered a prayer her mother had taught her. Then she began planning her escape. 20 years earlier, 10-year-old Eleanor sat on the front porch of her family's small house, watching the dust clouds rise from the main road. Willow Creek, Nebraska stretched out before her like a painting that never changed. Her father's blacksmith shop stood across the dirt street, smoke rising from the chimney even in the summer heat. The sound of his hammer hitting metal rang through the air like a heartbeat. Her mother sat beside her, fingers moving quickly as she stitched another quilt square. The colors were bright blues and yellows, like the sky and sunflowers that grew wild behind their house. Eleanor loved the smell of her mother's sewing basket, thread and fabric, and the lavender soap she used to wash her hands. But even then, Eleanor knew she wanted more than what Willow Creek could offer. At school, Eleanor was different from the other children. While they talked about helping their families with farm work, Eleanor read every book she could find. The schoolhouse had only 12 books, but Eleanor had read them all 3 times. Her teacher, Miss Patterson, noticed how quickly Eleanor learned new things. She would stay after school to help Eleanor with mathematics and writing. "You have a gift, child," Miss Patterson would say. "Don't let anyone tell you that dreams are too big for a girl from Willow Creek." Eleanor's father didn't understand why she needed so much schooling. He believed women should learn to cook and clean and raise children. But her mother would slip Eleanor extra books that traveling merchants sometimes left behind. She never said anything to Eleanor's father about these secret gifts. When Eleanor turned 18, she made an announcement that shocked the whole town. She was going to college in Omaha to become a teacher. Her father's face turned red with anger. He slammed his fist on the dinner table so hard that the salt shaker fell over. "No daughter of mine is going to waste money on fancy education," he shouted. "You'll marry a good man from town and raise his children like your mother did." But Eleanor's mother surprised everyone. She stood up slowly, her hands still covered in flour from making bread. "She's going," she said quietly. "I've been saving money from my quilt sales for 4 years. Eleanor is going to make something of herself." The room went completely silent. Eleanor had never heard her mother speak against her father before. The night before Eleanor left for Omaha, her mother came to her room carrying a small wooden box. Inside were $57, more money than Eleanor had ever seen. Her mother's hands were rough from years of sewing and cooking and cleaning, but they were gentle as she placed the money in Eleanor's palm. "This is for you," she whispered. "Your father doesn't know about this money. I sold quilts in the next town over for years, saving every penny. You're going to be somebody important, Eleanor. I can feel it in my bones." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She hugged her mother tight, smelling the lavender soap and feeling the strength in her thin arms. Outside, her father was still hammering in his shop, angry sparks flying in the darkness. Eleanor packed her few belongings in a cloth suitcase her mother had sewn. One dress for church, one for everyday wear, and one for special occasions. 3 books that Miss Patterson had given her as graduation gifts. A photograph of her parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful, before life had worn them down. As she folded her clothes, Eleanor made a promise to herself. She would study hard, become a teacher, and make enough money to bring her mother to Omaha someday. She would show her father that education wasn't a waste. She would prove that a girl from Willow Creek could be anything she wanted to be. The train whistle sounded in the distance, calling her toward her future. Eleanor Rose Carter was ready to answer that call. By 1966, Eleanor had been teaching for 2 years at Lincoln Elementary on the outskirts of Omaha. Her classroom was small and filled with sunlight that streamed through tall windows. 23 children sat at wooden desks that Eleanor had painted bright colors during her summer break. She loved watching their faces light up when they finally understood a difficult lesson. Teaching paid enough for Eleanor to rent a tiny apartment above Mrs. Murphy's bakery. The smell of fresh bread woke her every morning, and she felt grateful for her simple but independent life. She sent money home to her mother every month, along with letters describing her students and the books she was reading. Eleanor thought she had everything she needed. She was wrong. Her friend Sylvia convinced Eleanor to take a vacation to Lake Superior that summer. "You work too hard," Sylvia said. "You need to see something beautiful and remember that there's a whole world outside that classroom." Eleanor had never traveled anywhere for pleasure. The idea scared and excited her at the same time. She saved money for months, buying a new blue dress and a pair of walking shoes that didn't have holes in the soles. The train ride to Lake Superior took 14 hours, and Eleanor pressed her face to the window the entire time. She had never seen mountains or forests that stretched beyond the horizon. When she finally saw the lake, she gasped out loud. The water was so blue it looked like liquid sky, and it went on forever. On her third day at the lake, Eleanor was reading on a bench overlooking the water when a shadow fell across her book. She looked up to see a tall man with dark hair and the kindest brown eyes she had ever seen. He was wearing a clean white shirt and dark trousers that looked expensive but not flashy. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice gentle and warm. "But I've been watching you read for an hour, and I have to know what book could be so captivating." Eleanor felt her cheeks turn pink, but something about his smile made her feel comfortable. "It's Jane Eyre," she said. "Have you read it?" His face lit up. "It's one of my favorites. Would you mind if I sat with you for a moment?" Eleanor scooted over on the bench, her heart beating faster than it should. Daniel Hartsfield was unlike any man Eleanor had ever met. He was educated and well-traveled, but he listened to her opinions like they mattered. He told her about his family's land holdings in Lincoln, but he didn't brag about his wealth. Instead, he asked about her teaching and her dreams for the future. They spent the entire afternoon talking about books and traveling and what made life meaningful. When the sun began to set over the lake, Daniel walked Eleanor back to her boarding house. "May I write to you when you return to Omaha?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had never felt this way about anyone before. Her practical mind told her to be careful, but her heart was already lost. That night, Eleanor lay awake thinking about Daniel's laugh and the way he had listened to every word she said. She wondered what it would be like to have someone to share her thoughts with every day. Someone who understood her love of learning and her dreams of seeing the world. She didn't know that Daniel was lying awake in his hotel room, thinking the same thoughts. She didn't know that he came from a family with dark secrets and twisted traditions. She didn't know that falling in love with Daniel Hartsfield would lead her to the most terrifying night of her life. All she knew was that for the first time, she felt like she had found someone who truly saw her. The girl from Willow Creek who had always felt like she didn't belong anywhere had finally found her place. Or so she thought. Eleanor's small apartment transformed into a shrine of correspondence. Every week, thick cream-colored envelopes arrived with Daniel's careful handwriting across the front. She would rush up the stairs after teaching, her heart pounding with excitement. His letters painted pictures of his life in Lincoln, the way morning fog rolled across his family's vast property, the sound of cattle calling to each other at sunset, the smell of hay fresh from the fields. Eleanor had never imagined that farming could sound so romantic and peaceful. She wrote back about her students, the books she was reading, and her dreams of traveling to places like Paris and London someday. Daniel's responses showed that he remembered every detail she shared. He was building a picture of her heart, piece by piece. Winter melted into spring, and Daniel began visiting Eleanor on weekends. He would take the train from Lincoln, carrying flowers from his family's garden and books he thought she would enjoy. They would walk through Omaha's parks, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Daniel was different from the farm boys back in Willow Creek. He had attended university and could discuss literature and politics and philosophy. But more than that, he treated Eleanor like an equal. He asked for her opinions and listened to her answers. When other men looked through Eleanor like she was invisible, Daniel saw her completely. Eleanor began to believe that maybe she had found her fairy tale ending. She had no idea that fairy tales often hide the darkest truths. By Christmas of 1967, Eleanor knew she was in love. Daniel's letters came every 3 days now, and each one made her feel like the most important person in the world. He wrote about wanting to show her his family home, about the library his grandfather had built with books from around the world. Eleanor imagined herself in that library, reading beside a fireplace while snow fell outside. She dreamed of cooking meals in a real kitchen instead of the tiny stove in her apartment. Most of all, she dreamed of waking up beside someone who loved her mind as much as her heart. When Daniel mentioned marriage in his February letter, Eleanor's hands shook as she read the words. "I cannot imagine my life without you," he wrote. "Would you consider becoming my wife?" Eleanor wrote back immediately, her pen moving across the paper like it had a mind of its own. Yes, she wrote simply. Yes to everything. She mailed the letter before she could change her mind, then spent the rest of the night pacing around her apartment. 3 days later, Daniel appeared at her door with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. It was a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the light like a star. As he slipped it onto her finger, Eleanor felt like her real life was finally beginning. She imagined her mother's face when she saw the ring. She imagined her father admitting that maybe education had been worth it after all. She had no way of knowing that the Hartsfield family ring came with invisible chains attached. In June, Eleanor traveled to Lincoln to meet Daniel's family for the first time. The train carried her through landscapes she had only seen in pictures, rolling hills covered in green grass that seemed to stretch forever. Daniel met her at the station in a polished black carriage that looked like something from a storybook. As they drove toward the Hartsfield estate, Eleanor pressed her face to the window in wonder. The house appeared through the trees like a castle from her childhood dreams. 3 stories tall with white columns and windows that sparkled in the afternoon sun. It's beautiful, Eleanor whispered. Daniel squeezed her hand, but something in his eyes looked worried. My family can be traditional, he said carefully. Just remember that I love you, no matter what happens. Eleanor laughed and kissed his cheek. How could anything bad happen in such a perfect place? The Hartsfield mansion rose before Eleanor like something from a dream that was slowly turning into a nightmare. White columns stretched 3 stories high, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. Servants moved like ghosts across the grounds, their eyes downcast, speaking only when spoken to. Eleanor clutched Daniel's arm as they climbed the marble steps to the front door. The house was beautiful, but something felt wrong. The air itself seemed heavy, like it was holding secrets that were too dark to speak out loud. When the massive oak doors opened, Eleanor saw a man who looked exactly like Daniel would in 30 years. Mr. Clarence Hartsfield stood in the doorway wearing a grey suit that probably cost more than Eleanor made in 6 months. His smile was perfect and cold as winter ice. So this is the little teacher, Clarence said, looking Eleanor up and down like she was a horse he was considering buying. His voice was smooth as honey, but Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. Behind him stood Mrs. Hartsfield, a thin woman whose beauty had been carved away by years of living with secrets. She wore a blue silk dress that matched her eyes, but those eyes looked hollow and haunted. Welcome to our home, dear, she said in a voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor shook both their hands, noting that Clarence held hers too long and too firmly. The house smelled like expensive furniture polish and something else Eleanor couldn't identify, something that reminded her of fear. Daniel's brothers appeared in the hallway, all wearing the same cold smile as their father. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have held Eleanor's entire apartment. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight like trapped stars. The table was set with china so delicate Eleanor was afraid to touch it. Clarence sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, and Eleanor quickly realized that every conversation had to flow through him. When she mentioned her teaching, he laughed dismissively. Of course you won't need to work after the wedding, he said, cutting his steak with sharp, precise movements. Hartsfield women have more important duties. Eleanor looked at Daniel, waiting for him to defend her, but he just stared at his plate. Mrs. Hartsfield's fork trembled slightly as she ate, and Eleanor noticed bruises on her wrists that makeup couldn't quite hide. After dinner, Daniel showed Eleanor to the guest room on the 2nd floor. The room was beautiful, a 4-poster bed with silk curtains, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, and windows that overlooked gardens lit by moonlight. But as Daniel kissed her goodnight, Eleanor saw something in his eyes that scared her. Is everything all right? She asked, touching his face gently. Daniel looked like he wanted to say something important, something that might change everything. Instead, he just smiled and said, "Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll plan the wedding." As he closed the door behind him, Eleanor heard the soft click of a lock turning. She tried the handle, and her heart sank. She was locked in. The beautiful room had become a beautiful prison. Eleanor sat on the bed, her mind racing with questions she was afraid to answer. Why had Daniel locked her in? Why did Mrs. Hartsfield look so frightened? Why did Clarence's smile never reach his eyes? She walked to the window and looked down at the gardens below. The drop was too far to survive, and besides, where would she go in the middle of nowhere? She was miles from the nearest town, with no money and no way to get home. Eleanor thought about her mother's worried face when she left for this trip. Her mother had sensed something was wrong, had begged Eleanor to be careful. Rich families have their own rules, she had warned. Eleanor had laughed and kissed her mother's cheek. Now, sitting alone in this locked room, Eleanor finally understood what her mother had been trying to tell her. Eleanor's wedding day dawned gray and cold, with clouds that looked like they were holding back tears. She stood at the bedroom window, still in her nightgown, watching servants prepare the gardens below for the ceremony. White chairs arranged in perfect rows, flowers that had been cut before sunrise, tables covered with lace that probably cost more than her father made in a year. Everything looked beautiful and perfect and wrong. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging the window. In 3 hours, she would be Mrs. Daniel Hartsfield. In 3 hours, she would belong to this family and all their dark traditions. The lock on her door had clicked open at dawn, but Eleanor knew she was still trapped. Where could she run to in the middle of nowhere, wearing nothing but her nightgown? Mrs. Hartsfield appeared in the doorway carrying Eleanor's wedding dress, a creation of white silk and lace that had been worn by Hartsfield brides for 3 generations. The dress was beautiful, but as Mrs. Hartsfield helped Eleanor into it, her hands shook like autumn leaves. "You're very brave," she whispered so quietly Eleanor almost missed it. "Braver than I was." Eleanor looked at the older woman's reflection in the mirror, seeing years of pain carved into the lines around her eyes. "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, but Mrs. Hartsfield just shook her head and continued fastening the tiny pearl buttons that ran up Eleanor's back. Each button felt like a chain link, binding Eleanor to a future she was beginning to fear. Outside, she could hear the sound of carriages arriving, filled with guests who had come to witness her beautiful mistake. The ceremony took place in the garden as planned, but Eleanor felt like she was watching it happen to someone else. She walked down the aisle between chairs filled with people she didn't know, all of them staring at her with expressions she couldn't read. Some looked sad, some looked sorry for her, and some looked like they knew a secret she didn't. Daniel waited for her at the altar, handsome in his black suit, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. The preacher spoke about love and honor and obedience, but his voice sounded far away, like it was coming from underwater. When Daniel slipped the gold ring onto her finger, Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air. The ring was beautiful, but it felt heavy as a shackle. The guests applauded politely when Daniel kissed her, but Eleanor heard no joy in the sound. The reception feast was a blur of faces and food and forced smiles. Eleanor sat at the head table feeling like a doll on display. Clarence gave a speech about family traditions and the importance of keeping bloodlines strong. His eyes lingered on Eleanor as he spoke, and she felt like prey being studied by a hungry wolf. Daniel's hand found hers under the table, and she squeezed it desperately, hoping he could feel her fear through her fingertips. But when she looked at his face, she saw that he was as pale as she was. Whatever was coming next, Daniel knew about it. And he was going to let it happen anyway. Eleanor's wedding cake tasted like sawdust in her mouth. The champagne burned her throat like poison. As the sun set behind the trees, Eleanor realized this wasn't a celebration. It was a funeral for the life she used to have. When the last guest had gone home and the servants had cleared away the tables, Clarence approached Eleanor with that same cold smile. "Time for you to learn about Hartsfield family traditions," he said, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. Eleanor looked desperately at Daniel, but he was already walking toward the house, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Mrs. Hartsfield touched Eleanor's arm gently, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Then she turned and followed her son into the house, leaving Eleanor alone with Clarence under the darkening sky. Eleanor's beautiful wedding dress suddenly felt like a costume for a play she had never auditioned for. As Clarence led her toward the house, Eleanor Carter Hartsfield realized that her real nightmare was just beginning. Eleanor's feet felt like lead as Clarence guided her through the mansion's dark hallways. Family portraits stared down from the walls, generations of Hartsfield men with the same cold eyes and cruel smiles. Their painted faces seemed to whisper approval for what was about to happen. Eleanor's wedding dress rustled against the hardwood floors like the sound of dead leaves. Clarence's grip on her arm was firm but not yet painful. He was being gentle, like a cat playing with a mouse before the kill. "Every Hartsfield bride goes through this," he said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "It's been our way for over 100 years. Keeps the family strong, keeps the bloodline pure." Eleanor's stomach turned to ice. She finally understood what Mrs. Hartsfield had been trying to warn her about. They stopped outside a heavy wooden door on the 3rd floor, a room Eleanor had never seen during her tour of the house. Clarence produced an old brass key from his vest pocket, and Eleanor heard the lock turn with a sound like a prison door opening. Inside was a bedroom decorated in deep reds and golds, with a massive bed that dominated the center of the room. Thick curtains blocked out the moonlight, and candles flickered on every surface, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The room smelled like expensive cologne mixed with something darker, the scent of fear and shame that had soaked into the wood over decades. Eleanor backed toward the door, but Clarence was already blocking her path. His smile never wavered, but his eyes had turned hungry and predatory. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said softly. Eleanor's mind raced as she searched for a way out. The windows were too high to jump from, and Clarence was bigger and stronger than her. But then her eyes fell on the writing desk in the corner of the room. A silver letter opener lay next to a stack of papers, its blade glinting in the candlelight. Eleanor had never been violent in her life, but she had also never been trapped like this before. As Clarence began removing his jacket, Eleanor moved toward the desk with careful, quiet steps. Her wedding dress whispered against her legs as she reached for the letter opener, its handle cold and solid in her palm. When Clarence turned around and saw what she was holding, his smile finally disappeared. "Put that down, girl," he said, his voice sharp with anger. "You're part of this family now. You'll do as you're told." "I'll die first," Eleanor said, and she meant every word. The letter opener felt heavier in her hand, like it was filling with all the strength her mother had passed down to her, all the stubbornness her father had tried to beat out of her, all the dreams she had fought so hard to achieve. Clarence laughed, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now. "You don't have the stomach for it," he said, taking a step toward her. Eleanor raised the blade higher, pointing it directly at her own heart. "Try me," she whispered. Something in her voice made Clarence stop in his tracks. For the first time in his life, someone was standing up to the great Clarence Hartsfield. A schoolteacher from Nebraska who weighed barely 100 pounds was staring him down with death in her eyes. The room fell silent except for the sound of Eleanor's rapid breathing and the soft flicker of candle flames. Clarence studied her face, looking for weakness, for fear, for the moment when she would break and submit like all the others had. But Eleanor Rose Carter had been forged in her father's blacksmith shop and tempered by her mother's quiet strength. She had fought her way out of Willow Creek with nothing but books and determination. She had built a life from scratch in a strange city where she knew no one. This rich, powerful man thought he could take everything from her, but he had underestimated what he was dealing with. Eleanor pressed the tip of the letter opener against her chest, right over her heart. "If you take one more step," she said clearly, "I'll push this blade in and bleed all over your precious family tradition. Is that what you want your son to find in the morning?" Clarence's face twisted with rage and something Eleanor had never seen before in his cold eyes. Fear. He was a man who had built his power on intimidation and control, and now a 24-year-old schoolteacher was threatening to destroy everything with one desperate act. The letter opener trembled in Eleanor's hand, not from fear but from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, loud as thunder. Outside the room, the house was silent. Daniel and his mother had abandoned her to face this monster alone. But Eleanor wasn't truly alone. She carried the strength of every woman who had ever been told she was powerless, every dreamer who had ever been told to settle for less. "You're insane," Clarence whispered, backing toward the door. Eleanor smiled, and for the first time all day, it was genuine. "Maybe," she said. "But I'd rather be a dead crazy woman than a living victim." The standoff lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Eleanor kept the letter opener pressed against her chest while Clarence paced like a caged animal, his face growing redder with each passing second. Finally, he threw his hands up in disgust. "Fine," he snarled. "But don't think this is over. You're a Hartsfield now, whether you like it or not. This family owns you." With that, he stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard the candles flickered. Eleanor heard the key turn in the lock, trapping her inside the nightmare room. She collapsed onto the carpet, her whole body shaking as the reality of what had just happened hit her. She was alive, but she was still a prisoner. The letter opener fell from her numb fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor like a prayer answered. Eleanor spent the longest night of her life sitting by the locked door, still wearing her wedding dress, planning her escape. She knew Clarence wouldn't give up. Men like him never did. He would wait for another opportunity, maybe when she was tired or sick or caught off guard. She had to get out of this house, away from this family, before he had another chance to hurt her. As dawn broke through the heavy curtains, Eleanor heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside. The lock clicked, and the door opened just wide enough for a young woman to slip inside. She was about Eleanor's age, wearing a simple gray dress and carrying a bundle of clothes. "I'm Amelia," she whispered. "My father takes care of the grounds here. Mrs. Hartsfield sent me to help you." Amelia moved quickly and quietly, helping Eleanor out of the elaborate wedding dress and into the simple brown traveling outfit she had brought. "There's a carriage waiting by the back gate," Amelia explained in hushed tones. "It will take you to the train station in town. Mrs. Hartsfield bought your ticket. It's in this envelope along with some money." Eleanor's hands shook as she took the envelope, hardly daring to believe that escape was possible. Inside was a train ticket to Omaha and $50, enough to start over. "Why are you helping me?" Eleanor asked. Amelia's young face looked older than her years as she answered. "Because Mrs. Hartsfield asked me to. And because no woman should have to live in fear like she has for 25 years. Eleanor understood then that Mrs. Hartsfield had lived through the same nightmare, but had never found the courage to fight back. Now she was saving Eleanor from the same fate. The escape happened like something from a dream. Amelia led Eleanor through servant passages she never knew existed, down narrow stairs that creaked with age, through a kitchen that smelled like bread and coffee. The back door opened onto gardens still wet with morning dew, and beyond that, a small carriage waited with a driver who nodded but didn't speak. Eleanor climbed into the carriage with nothing but the clothes on her back, and the envelope clutched in her hand. As they drove away from the Hartsfield mansion, Eleanor looked back only once. She saw Mrs. Hartsfield standing at an upstairs window, her hand pressed against the glass in a silent farewell. Eleanor pressed her own hand to her heart, where the letter opener had been ready to end everything rather than submit to evil. She was free, but the scars from this night would follow her forever. The girl from Willow Creek had learned that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to be willing to lose everything. Eleanor's hands shook as she unlocked the door to her small apartment above Mrs. Murphy's bakery. 3 days had passed since her escape from the Hartsfield mansion. 3 days of hiding in cheap hotels and looking over her shoulder at every sound. The smell of fresh bread that used to comfort her now made her stomach turn. Everything familiar felt foreign, like she was a stranger in her own life. She had left Omaha as Eleanor Rose Carter, full of hope and dreams of love. She had returned as Eleanor Hartsfield, a woman who had stared death in the face and chosen it over dishonor. The wedding ring on her finger felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She twisted it off and threw it across the room, where it rolled under her tiny stove and disappeared. She never wanted to see it again. Her friend Sylvia arrived an hour later, carrying soup and fresh bread from the bakery downstairs. Eleanor had sent her a telegram that said only, "Come quickly. Need help." Sylvia took one look at Eleanor's hollow eyes and tear-stained face and understood that something terrible had happened. Eleanor told her everything, the locked doors, Clarence's demands, the family tradition that turned wives into victims, the letter opener that had saved her life. Sylvia held Eleanor's hands while she spoke, tears streaming down both their faces. "You were so brave," Sylvia whispered. "So much braver than anyone should have to be." But Eleanor didn't feel brave. She felt broken, like a piece of china that had been dropped and glued back together. The cracks would always show, no matter how carefully she tried to hide them. The next morning brought a letter that made Eleanor's blood run cold. The envelope was expensive cream paper with the Hartsfield family seal pressed into red wax. Inside, Clarence's handwriting was perfectly controlled, each letter formed with the precision of a man accustomed to getting his way. "My dear daughter-in-law," the letter began, and Eleanor's hands started shaking. "Your little tantrum has been most amusing, but it's time to come home. You belong to this family now, and we protect what belongs to us. Daniel is heartbroken by your abandonment. Surely you can find it in your heart to forgive a misunderstanding and return to your husband who loves you so dearly." The letter was signed with Clarence's full name and title, as if he were conducting business rather than threatening a young woman's life. Eleanor burned the letter in her tiny fireplace and watched the ashes scatter like her dreams had. Eleanor knew she couldn't stay in Omaha. The Hartsfields had money and influence, and Clarence was the kind of man who would never stop hunting what he considered his property. She needed to disappear, to become someone else, someone the Hartsfields could never find. That afternoon, she walked to the courthouse and began the process of annulling her marriage. The clerk was kind but confused. Annulments were rare, and usually only granted in cases of fraud or coercion. "Did your husband lie to you about something important?" the clerk asked. Eleanor almost laughed. "If only it were that simple. He failed to protect me when I needed him most," she said finally. The clerk stamped her papers and told her the process would take several months. Several months of living in fear, of jumping at every shadow, of wondering if today would be the day Clarence came to collect his prize. That night, Eleanor packed everything she owned into 2 small suitcases. She would leave Omaha in the morning and travel west to Colorado, where she could teach in a mountain town where no one knew. 5 years had passed since Eleanor fled the Hartsfield mansion, and now she stood in the doorway of her classroom in Pine Ridge, Colorado, watching her students pack their books for summer vacation. The mountain air had healed something in her soul that she thought was broken forever. Pine Ridge was a small mining town where people minded their own business and judged others by their actions, not their past. Eleanor had built a good life here, a small house with a garden where she grew vegetables and wildflowers, students who loved learning as much as she did, and friends who accepted her without asking too many questions about where she came from. The nightmares about Clarence had finally stopped, and Eleanor had begun to believe that maybe she could be happy alone. Then Thomas James Warren walked into her life like sunshine after a storm. Thomas was an architect who had come to Pine Ridge to design a new school building. He was a widower with a 10-year-old son named Michael, and there was something about the quiet sadness in his green eyes that called to the wounded places in Eleanor's heart. Unlike Daniel, who had charmed her with grand gestures and flowery words, Thomas was steady and real. He asked permission before touching her hand. He listened when she spoke and remembered what she said. Most importantly, he never pushed for more than she was ready to give. Their courtship was slow and careful, like 2 people who had both learned that love could be dangerous if you weren't careful with it. Eleanor told him about her first marriage, leaving out the worst details but making it clear that she had been hurt badly. Thomas nodded and said simply, "Then I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel that way again." Their wedding in 1972 was everything Eleanor's first wedding hadn't been. Small and simple, held in the little church in Pine Ridge with only their closest friends as witnesses. Eleanor wore a blue dress she had sewn herself, and Thomas's son Michael walked her down the aisle because her father had passed away the winter before. Eleanor's mother had made the journey from Nebraska, her face glowing with pride and relief. She could see that Thomas was different from Daniel, that his love for Eleanor was protective rather than possessive. The preacher spoke about second chances and new beginnings, and when Thomas slipped a simple gold band onto Eleanor's finger, she felt only joy. That night, in their own home, Thomas held Eleanor gently while she cried, Not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of finally feeling safe in someone's arms. Eleanor and Thomas built a beautiful life together in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. Thomas adopted Eleanor as Michael's mother, and she loved that serious, thoughtful boy as if she had given birth to him herself. They had 3 children of their own, Emma in 1974, Lucas in 1976, and Sarah in 1978. Their house was always full of laughter and books and the sound of children playing. Thomas designed and built them a larger home with a library just for Eleanor, walls lined with books from floor to ceiling and windows that looked out over the mountains. On Sunday mornings, the whole family would sit together in that library while Eleanor read aloud from classic novels and Thomas helped the children with their arithmetic. These were the happiest years of Eleanor's life, so rich and full that sometimes she forgot about the darkness that had once threatened to destroy her. Thomas lived until he was 73, passing peacefully in 2018 after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease. Eleanor held his hand as he slipped away, grateful for every year they had shared together. At his funeral, their children and grandchildren told stories about a man who had loved deeply and lived with honor. Michael, now a successful doctor, spoke about the stepmother who had loved him unconditionally and the father who had shown him how a real man treats the woman he loves. As Eleanor sat in the front pew, surrounded by the family she and Thomas had created together, she thought about the young woman she had been all those years ago. That frightened girl in the wedding dress had thought her life was over. But sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead us to the best things we never knew we needed. Eleanor Rose Warren was 81 years old, and her story was one of triumph over darkness, love over fear, and second chances that sometimes turn out to be even better than first ones. She looked out at her grandchildren's faces and smiled, knowing that her legacy would be love, not trauma. That was worth fighting for. That was worth surviving for. That was everything.